Chapter 15. Life in Scotland. R.A.F. Kinloss is situated in the Moragshire coast on the edge of Findhorn Bay. Findhorn village is only a mile or so from the airfield in a direct line, but 3 miles by road. The country town of Forres is 5 miles away and the towns of Nairn and Elgin are about 10 miles away, with the nearest city being Inverness some 30 miles to the west. Known as the Highland capital, the Morayshire coast is warmed by the Gulf Stream, which circles around from the Atlantic around the North Cape. Consequently, the coastal strip seldom gets snow lying on the ground, but, of course, it does get frequent snow showers. Inland only a few miles away is Dartmoor, and that can get well and truly snowbound. Morayshire and Inverness are areas of spectacular coastal and mountain scenery, with the Grampian Mountains to the south and the Cairngorm Range to the northwest. It is indeed the true Highlands of Scotland. In 1948 and for a few years more it was still a remote area. Petrol rationing remained enforced, so tourism had not built up very much since the war ended. It was to be a long time before the discovery of oil fields in the North Sea, which brought many changes that many feel had spoiled the charm of the Highlands in that area. R.A.F. Kinloss housed 2 units, number 236 Operational Conversion Unit. Training coastal command crews on the Lancaster Mark X. These aircraft were modified from the bomber role to that of maritime surveillance. A maintenance unit was the other unit on the base, which held on its inventory a wide range of the aircraft. This unit was one of a number where newly produced aircraft no longer required for the war were sent to be parked until they could be disposed of. The aircraft being held numbered several hundred at its peak. There were Halifaxes, Beaufighters, Buckmasters, Lancasters and a number of trainer aircraft. The MU also prepared replacement aircraft for units that were still flying. It was, therefore, a busy and interesting airfield to be based on when so many throughout the UK were winding down, or had already closed down. Coastal Command student crews spent up to 6 months at Kinloss before joining coastal squadrons worldwide. Some crews went on from their Lancaster conversion to fly Sunderland flying boats, which were still in service with a number of squadrons. Accommodation for families was scarce, and there were only a few married quarters on the station, but most service families managed to rent accommodation in the surrounding villages and towns. I was, therefore, forced to be separated from Gladys and Valerie for some considerable time before we could get accommodation of any sort. Because of this reliance on local people, we had a wonderful relationship with the community. The remoteness of the base meant that the station personnel could not get away easily, because even if they came from Scottish homes and cities like Glasgow and Edinburgh, they were still some 200 miles away. With petrol rationing, few people on the base had cars, and this meant that they made their recreation and sport in the local area, or on the base itself. It was, however, good for morale to have so many personnel on base, which enabled all sorts of recreational activities to take place at weekends. I became officer in charge of soccer and arranged large parts of the grass areas between the runway to be converted to football fields where we could run 8 matches at a time. In fact, we ran an inter-section league of 16 teams, with most of the games being played on Sundays. One unusual experience I had as officer IC soccer involved a trip to Wembley Stadium in London for the FA Cup final. Each year the R.A.A.F. received a few tickets for each station for the match. Tickets were as much in demand then, as they still are now. We received 3-seat tickets. I got one and our secretary other, and also one for a team member. The secretary and I met up at Wembley, where we were to meet a team member at an agreed spot to collect his ticket. We waited as long as we could for him to arrive without success. So we had a spare ticket, and there was no way I could sell it, not being a ticket tout. The ticket would have fetched a large sum to the people there hoping to buy a ticket. The other chap and I decided to give it away to a serviceman, preferably R.A.F, but the only chap in uniform was a soldier, so we offered it to him. How much? He asked. Nothing, I said. Have it on the R.A.F, blimey. He's said who'd believe this. I bet he still tells the story today, about how he went to the cup final and was given a free ticket. In those days the pubs were closed on Sundays in Scotland, and unless you were a bona fide traveller you could not get a drink off the base, even at a hotel. The bona fide traveller could be established by signing a book to signify that you had travelled at least 3 miles to get to the hotel. The railways and local bus companies facilitated this requirement by running boozer specials from one town to another, on Sundays only, and for journeys of just over 3 miles. R.A.F. Kinloss, at this time, had teams of all sorts in the local leagues. The base played in the Highland League at soccer and in the North of Scotland League at cricket, which all served to integrate the service and civilian populations into a close community. I never experienced this closeness to the same degree ever again in the R.A.A.F. as large numbers of married quarters were being built on bases. Service personnel tended to be more insular as the years went by, forming their own communities on the bases and becoming divided from the local civilian environment. As far as work was concerned, I soon got into the flying and enjoyed being back on my beloved Lancaster. In addition, I found it interesting to learn my new role as a coastal command pilot. As a new instructor, I first had to learn all the conversion training exercises, which meant going through each exercise with an experienced instructor and then repeating it back to him. After a completion of all these exercises, I was given a squadron commander's check by squadron leader Boss Rayner, who passed me fit to commence teaching the course students. In between these exercises, I had been doing other sorts of flying and had flown to a number of other places in Scotland and England, mostly on delivery and liaison flights. One of the flights took me to the Isle of Man, to Ronaldsway Airport, near to Douglas, where my mother was born. I found flying around the coast of Scotland and over the Highlands quite fascinating and never tired of appreciating its beauty. With the need to fly so accurately when doing student demonstrations, I found my flying in general got better all the time. As I grew into the role as a coastal pilot, I was able to go as screen pilot on the longer operational exercises, which covered the complete range of maritime role activities. Tracking ships and submarines, practice bombing, and various sea searches were all part of this interesting facet of R.A.F. operations. Having spent so much time flying in the high-level bomber role, it was a distinct change to fly most sorties over the sea at around 500 feet above the waves. The north of Scotland has so many interesting offshore island areas such as the Orkneys, the Shetlands, and further north to the west the Hebrides. From time to time we would also visit coastal bases in Northern Ireland, at Aldergrove near Belfast and Ballykelly just outside Londonderry. Sometimes our flights took us as far as Iceland and the Faroe Islands. Kinloss also had a station communications flight and I was put in charge of it. We had an Anson, used in a communications role and also as an air ambulance. The flight also had a Miles Martinet and a Mk-16 Spitfire, to operate in support of the training of their gunners and the coastal crews. Because of shortages of pilots to run the flight, we instructors were able to fly all these aircraft in their respective roles. Furthermore, there was, at the time, a dispute over civil air ambulance facilities in Scotland. Whilst this dispute was on, R.A.F. Kinloss provided air ambulance coverage. One trip I did was to fly to an airman, who was very seriously ill with meningitis, from R.A.F. Stornoway in the Hebrides to Dice Airport near Aberdeen. He was not expected to live, but, combined with my flight, a Mosquito aircraft flew from London with a consignment of streptomycin to treat his condition. Both flights received considerable publicity. The flight from Stornoway had to be flown at low level because of the patient's condition, and as the flight was flown in pretty rough conditions, I was fearful that he would not survive to reach Aberdeen. Fortunately, he did, and I was pleased to hear later that he had recovered, which was very rewarding to learn. One other ambulance flight I did was especially poignant. I collected a sick young waif from Lucas near St Andrews, and flew her to her home in the Hebrides. She was terminally ill with cancer and was a lovely looking girl, although obviously ill. I sat her up the front with me and she was so calm and appreciative. She was a very brave young lady and I was quite moved by the experience. On another occasion, along with a navigator friend, Don Donaghy from Kilmarnock, we were loaned to the Fleet Air Arm for 4 days to fly ambulance sorties, from Eglinton to Northern Ireland. We flew patients each day between Eglinton and Leon-Solent near Portsmouth on the Hampshire coast of England. It was a fascinating 3 days, and on our free evenings we crossed into Donegal in Eire, to a town called Buncrana. This was my first visit to Eire, but, when we visited the Lochs Whale Hotel we had quite an adventure. One of our favourite drinks in those days in Scotland was called a black and tan, a mixture of stout and beer. When Don asked the barmaid for this drink, the whole bar crowd went silent. Pointedly, the barmaid said, "It's not a drink we sell here." He had not realized that the name Black and Tan was a feared name and era. The Black and Tans were a unit of British Army with a reputation for brutal suppression of the Irish. I immediately appreciated the need for quick action, and I called out that my friend does not realize the meaning of the words Black and Tan in era. Fortunately, my explanation was accepted, but I suggested we moved on as soon as we had finished our ordered drinks. The flying in the Martinet was to tow a drogue for the gunners and the student crews to practice live firing from the Lancaster rear turret. The Martinet was a nice aircraft to fly, but its engine had a habit of spitting out oil onto the aircraft windscreen. After a flight of more than an hour or so, the windscreen became completely covered in oil. This resulted in the pilot having to open the hood for landing and land by looking out to the side. The other endearing habit the aircraft engine had was to give stuttered momentary halt as you reeled out the drogue to the end of its cable length. All very disconcerting when you are over the sea, in a live firing range area. The Spitfire flights were a real joy, as all we had to do was tail chase one of the Lancasters and carry out mock fighter attacks. The gunners used cine film to simulate their firing at the fighter during the attacks. With these regular diversions from the normal training of pilots on the Lanc, flying was never dull. Early in my time at Kinloss, we had a change of station commander, much welcomed by all, for the outgoing incumbent was not liked at all. The new group captain was Eddie Dark, a really delightful pre-war officer, who was an armament specialist and had been off flying for some while. I was given the task of getting him back into flying practice on the Anson, a pleasant task which I much enjoyed. I took him on a number of trips to other bases, and the most interesting trip I did with him was to the R.A.A.F college at Cranwell, which gave me the chance to see this famous establishment functioning again in its peacetime role. Eddie Dark was very popular, as was his lovely lady wife, Hilda, and charming daughter Annie. When Gladys and I eventually found accommodation and she came to Kinloss, she got on very well with both Eddie and his wife. Our friendly relationship with the Darks, I am sure, helped a great deal in my career. After we had been at Kinloss about a year, the group captain recommended me for a permanent commission, which I subsequently succeeded in getting. At last my future was assured as a career officer. The accommodation situation remained a very difficult one, and all we could get was to share a rented flat with other R.A.A.F officers and their wives. It was not a really happy situation in the first few of these arrangements, until we got a quite fascinating opportunity which we gladly accepted. Near Forres was the home of the McKinnon clan chief, a beautiful lady named Aline McKinnon of McKinnon, who rented 3 flats and her large house with shared cooking and lounges. Miss McKinnon traveled a great deal and allowed us to use her own lounge and dining room when she was away. The house was named Drumdwan and was set in beautiful grounds, about a mile out of Forres. The McKinnons had a wonderful history, apart from just the clan history. Aline's father had been an England and Kent cricketer, and on his 98th birthday, just before he died, a cricket bat was presented to him with the signatures of 98 clan seniors worldwide. There was a great collection of cricket memorabilia and trophies in the house, which included several bats, formerly played with by the great W.G. Grace. I actually played with one bat several times, in the garden, but using a tennis ball in case it got damaged. On the other side of the family were the Hoods, one of whom had been Admiral Lord Hood, who had been one of Lord Nelson's commanders at the Battle of Trafalgar. The collection of mementos on display from Trafalgar were quite outstanding, and the house was like a museum in its own way. There was even the uniform worn by Colonel McKinnon, who fought at the Battle of Waterloo, receiving a personal letter from the sovereign commending him for his bravery. This was the ultimate award before the Victoria Cross was established. Needless to say, we had no trouble entertaining visitors by just showing them the unique collection of exhibits in the house. One final item of interest was that the McKinnon family held the well-kept secret recipe for drambuie. After a year at Drumdwan, we managed to rent a cottage on our own. It was the home of an R.A.A.F captain who went overseas, and it was a delightful cottage just by the sands, in the fishing village of Findhorn. Across from Findhorn Bay nearby were the famous Culbin Sands, where a village had been unearthed some years before. It had lay buried as a result of a series of great storms until it was found when forestry workers came across the ruins when digging to plant trees. Findhorn Bay was comically called Whitley Bay because so many Whitley bombers had crashed there when Kinloss was a Whitley training base during the war. Both at work and in recreation I travelled all over the north of Scotland. One of our favourite cricket matches was at Augustus Public School, halfway down the northern side of Loch Ness. It was a great day out at this historic school and the school staff and pupils treated us generously and with a beautiful, graceful and charming manner. Our wives were also invited and they loved the visit. We had a most enjoyable and sportsmanlike competitive match annually. One of the most unusual tasks I had to undertake was to Invergordon, site of the famous past naval base of Scapa Flow. The R.A.A.F had a marine craft unit there and I was ordered to conduct an inquiry into a case of indecent exposure involving a young National Service airman. He was accused of flashing at young girls on a quiet stretch of road outside Invergordon. He would expose his privates and drop coins on the ground in front of these young girls as they cycled by. The quaint part of my inquiry was visiting the crofters' cottages to take evidence. Now this part of Scotland is very staid, to say the least, and the parents insisted on being present. The young girls, usually aged 16 to 18, were very naive and no doubt very chaste and innocent. They had never heard of the word penis, and getting them to describe what they had seen was quite hilarious, but I had to keep a straight face. Eventually, the airman was not charged by court-martial, but sent for psychiatric treatment. To me it was one more fascinating and amusing incident in the life of a peacetime officer. Food rationing was still on and we managed to strike up an arrangement at Sombra in the Shetland Isles, the scene of the recent dramatic oil spill. The crofters on the Shetlands were allowed to sell a certain amount of their farm produce locally. We got onto this and once a month I flew up to Sunburge to collect eggs and a few less legal items for the officers' mess. The volume tended to grow each month, but, unfortunately, it eventually attracted the attention of some new customs officers. The last trip involved a very rapid departure from Sombra Airport, before the gentleman from customs arrived. That was the end of that venture. Flying over the 3.5 years at Kinloss was intensely interesting but not without drama. The first two dramatic incidents involved the notorious storms known in the area. On one occasion I had to land a Lancaster in wind gusts of up to 100 miles an hour. I landed in between the runways on the grass, in order to land into the high wind. As I landed a gust of 75 miles per hour blew, but I got the aircraft down in one piece. As I turned to taxi a further high gust struck, catching the elevator so hard that it snatched the control column from my grip, and smashed into the instrument panel, smashing several of the instruments to pieces. The second and much more hair-raising episode it occurred when I was flying an Anson back from Middleton St George in Yorkshire to Kinloss. Over the Cairngorms, at a height of 8,000 feet, we ran into a series of storms. We were suddenly struck by lightning which temporarily blinded me, causing me to be unable to maintain full control of the aircraft. The mountains were up to 3,500 feet high and in fighting to regain my sight and control I lost almost 4,000 feet. I regained my sight and got the aircraft under full control and climbed up to 6,000 feet. Although the lightning strike had sent the compass haywire, by a miracle the directional gyro had not toppled. I'll never know why we were so lucky and my two crew members also felt the same. Relying on the directional indicator for headings alone, and this instrument has inbuilt inaccuracies of about 10 degrees in 15 minutes from precession. We managed to steer the headings given to us by Kinloss air traffic. Again, very fortunately the VHF radio aerial had not been damaged. The controller on duty had regularly been criticized by other pilots as not being very competent. This time he came up trumps and gave me a radio letdown in terrible conditions. I broke cloud around 400 feet with heavy snow falling and just managed to see the runway lights about half a mile ahead. After the landing, the airfield had to be closed for the weather clamped in completely. It was a very close call and we owed a great deal to the competence and calmness of the controller. I let it known to all and sundry how well he had done, which ended further criticism of him. On another occasion I was taking off on a demonstration circuit with a student. It was about 3 AM and pitch dark. As we took off we flew into a flock of seagulls. One smashed the canopy above my head and I got covered in blood and gore. One engine temperature went up alarmingly, so I stopped that engine and landed on 3 engines. Later on a count of some 36 birds were removed from all over the wings, cockpit and engines, and parts of one from me. The engine that overheated was caused by several birds blocking the air intake. As a result of this incident, it was found that whenever there was a long lull in takeoff or landings at night, the flocks of seabirds would settle on the runways, which retained the warmth better than the grass did. From that time onwards, when such a lull occurred, a vehicle was driven down the runway to clear the birds before takeoffs or landings of aircraft were made. A further incident involved me in hot water with the air officer commanding No. 18 Group, Air Vice Marshal Carnegie. I was flying a Lincoln in a low pass during the Battle of Britain display. The wingtip seemed to be almost touching the ground, and when the AOC saw this, he wanted me court-martialed. Fortunately, the wing commander, Stuart Laird, a grand chap, foresaw this and called me in and gave me a rebuke for flying so low. When the AOC said he wanted action taken against me, Stuart Laird said that I had already been disciplined. Service regulations state that you cannot be disciplined twice for the same offense. By Stuart giving me that rebuke, and I am sure he had a faint smile when he did it, I could not be further punished. The AOC was not at all pleased. Well done and thank you, WG, Commander Laird. Many of our flights took us up and down Loch Ness, but I never saw any sign of the famous monster. My final days at Kinloss came to an end and I received a posting to R.A.F. Germany for staff officer duties. The Air Ministry had decreed that as a career officer I must now have a spell on staff work following 11 continuous years flying. I was not too pleased about that, but welcomed an overseas posting to Germany. During my 3.5 years at Kinloss, Gladys and I made many lifetime friendships. The most valued of these is to Squadron Leader Peter Cowison, his lovely wife Jean, along with their 2 children Peter and Sheila. We love them all dearly and stay with them whenever we go to England. Another and now distinguished friend is Air Vice Marshal Freddie Hazelwood and his charming wife Isabel, but there were so many others too numerous to record here. Kinloss was a very happy family for us instructors and our wives. Because of this we were terribly hurt when one of our crews were killed in a crash on takeoff at night. I was OC flying when we got an emergency call to prepare an aircraft and crew to fly to pick up naval divers. They were to go to a submarine sunk in the mouth of the River Thames off Gravesend. I offered to go, but the CO decided that it was best if I got the aircraft refueled and organized whilst he raised a crew, who duly arrived and got ready for takeoff. The flight engineer chosen was late arriving, so another chap volunteered to go. Just as the aircraft was about to taxi, the first engineer arrived and insisted on taking his place. 15 minutes later they were all dead as the aircraft crashed and burned out on a low hill a few miles from Kinloss. It was a poignant military funeral that took place to the mournful lilt of the station pipe band a few days later. We lost 3 great friends, Flight Lieutenant Le Harris, Gwyn Williams and Steve Stevens, and I will never forget them. It was the first time Gladys and I had been on a base where we had established close peacetime family-like relations with other officers and their wives. The widows of 2 of the officers killed were close friends of ours. Finally, it was with mixed feelings that I did one of my last flights out of Kinloss. It was a special flight because Kinloss had its first Arvo Shackleton, and Squadron Leader Bill Deacon took me up for a couple of hours handling of this fine new aircraft. Gladys and Valerie had gone back to Wales a few days earlier, but I flew my last Lancaster flight ever to Wales. Flight Lieutenant Mike Mays, a very good friend, now regrettably dead, went up with me to Wales and then flew the Lancaster back to Scotland. It was with great nostalgia that I flew this trip to bid farewell to this most wonderful aircraft. After a leave, having settled Gladys and Valerie in Carnarvon once more, I set off for my first post-war overseas posting and to Germany, where I had been before, but mostly to view on a bombing mission from 20,000 feet.